Throughout the day, and certainly for those of you that were here this morning, we've talked a lot about how the future of the workforce is changing, how the face of the workplace is likely to change, and the many different facets of that, which have hopefully been thought-provoking for you, and you're starting to think about what that might look like in your own world of work, and how Bright Futures might be able to help you on some of that journey. This panel is really about trying to get some local and national perspectives on what the tech guys are, and I include you to some extent in that, Paul, as a strategic leader. What are your observations when it comes to technical skills in the local markets, and what perhaps we need to be thinking about doing to prepare for the anticipated changes in perhaps areas of traditional IT itself, in upskilling that community to prepare for the opportunities of tomorrow. So, Justin, if I first may start with you.
So I'm going to start at the other end of the pyramid. So we've heard a lot about the tools today, the tech, the digital bit of digital transformation and the tools. We haven't spoken much about the transformation bit, which is us, right? So it's how we organise our businesses and our boards to enhance, to take hold of those opportunities that the tools give us. And I kind of think, specifically in the Guernsey context, we haven't had a crisis for quite a long time. So if we look at what happened in 2008 in the financial services sector, that didn't really happen here. It didn't really happen over here. We haven't had anything quite like the oil crisis of the 70s happened since the 70s, right? But what has happened is we've got all these amazing tools from a technological perspective being developed, but we haven't had the need to utilise them in our workplace yet. I personally think that we're right now in frog boiling mode here in Guernsey. We're in this water, it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and we're getting much, much closer to a tipping point. So when I talk about digital transformation, primarily at the moment, I'm talking about board level transformation. I'm talking about the boards, many of us in this room, thinking about transformation in the same way that we used to think about cybersecurity, which was a geeky thing, right? It was a bunch of tools and a bunch of techies. That was their problem. All of a sudden, it's not a technical problem anymore. It's a business problem, right? So right now, I urge everyone you don't have to understand the bits and bytes, you don't have to understand the whys and wherefores of cloud or on-prem compute. What you do understand is it's your job and our job to transition our workforce from what's quite a traditional way of working now. When you look outside the public service sector, second biggest employer is financial services sector, big chunk of that, fund administration. Big chunk of fund administration, there's a clue in the name, is administration. Obviously, I'm a telco guy, so in my mind, administration is largely mucking around with spreadsheets. That is absolutely ripe for automation. So when you look at the skills you need to work in fund administration, they're largely the same as a bank clerk, which is the most likely position to be disrupted. According to Morgan Stanley and Oxford University, 97% chance of that happening. So that's where I'll be looking. So what am I going to do with all these people? How am I going to help them? When technology comes, how are we going to help them? But then when you look at those core skills in that specific sector, they look really like data analysts. They look really like what's the guts of a data scientist. And it's those sorts of skills that we could be thinking about over the next 2-3 years and building an education system. So this is a transformation thing to help our workforce, and it plays to that longevity of the workforce piece that we were talking about a little bit earlier as well.
Yes, I think one of the things that's certainly been on our radar and was highlighted with the Amazon presentation was the changing face of learning, and how that has evolved quite radically to offer high quality, cost effective learning solutions across a whole spectrum of subject areas that perhaps wasn't available, as early as 5 years ago, but it is today. So that in itself, I think, could disrupt the existing provision on the islands provided we're prepared to embrace that and use that opportunity to enhance our human capital in that technology space. And just to put it out there, if you have identified a program as an individual or as an organisation and you're looking for funding on that or co-funding, we're absolutely up for having those conversations to fill those skills gaps. We might not see the ROI today, we might not see it next year, but we know that the value of investing today will reap the benefits of tomorrow, and that's what we're really passionate about. So thank you, really good insights. Gary, so from across the water, what observations are you picking up from some of your clients?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You go to conferences and what Ed mentioned about the cloud computing. So you can see these fantastic tools, and I come at this from two angles. Setting up a new business, we were able to set that up cloud first very quickly, use a lot of the services that Ed spoke about. We moved into an office and we moved our laptops in and we were done. And that shows you how quick it can happen. And my previous life of when doing the accounting, the cloud software on the accounting, and you look at it and you pay a few pounds per month and it hooks into the banks and you get the automated feeds. And then I work on client sites and they're paying six-figure sums and more to put in software that can't even compete with the stuff that I'm paying pounds from. So you get this, I can see what's possible, in the art of the possible, but I think honestly it's been slower to be adopted than I would have expected and hoped. You know, I've worked in sort of consulting for a while now, and this cloud computing, it's going to happen. And it just didn't, and it was still selling sort of tin on sort of premise. That is shifting now, because I think someone in the audience mentioned GDPR. I've worked for sort of large organizations, fund administrators, as an employee, and it always used to fall what I term the too difficult bucket. What are we going to do with data? Where does it matter where it lives? And it was like, and it was actually for even the lawyers couldn't agree with what they would do at that time. And I think what shifted was when FATCA came in, when you realize we're a transparent jurisdiction, as long as you have appropriate controls over the data, we're sending it to the US, and then everyone else got on the bandwagon, we're sending it around. So you're seeing these people, so data is being shared, do we have appropriate control over it? And then GDPR comes in and you have the actual legislation where you are much more accountable for the data. So we're starting to see big banks and big fund administrators adopting the public cloud where I hadn't seen that previously. So it's happening, but just not at the rate of pace of change that Ed probably would like, but it is happening in the offshore market, particularly in Jersey, and Matt can probably talk about what Guernsey.
And do you think that the slower uptake of the cloud technology is because of a lack of strategic thought leadership around the boardroom table?
Yes, I think potentially, because there would be people around our age at the table, and sitting around the table myself, so I can sit there as an accountant or a technologist, and it can be a bit worrying when the people sitting around the table don't actually know what decisions they are making. And so the gap of knowledge between traditional boards and then you wheel out the IT guy and they are not challenged. And you will get, some people will want an on-premise because that's what they know. You will get some people who like cloud first because they want to, or they see the benefits of that. And if the board aren't savvy enough to, or technologically savvy enough to challenge what the IT director is telling them, then it's just a sort of de facto. So having that, as you say, it's back to this bright futures whole point about upskilling everyone. So the whole tide is raised of that awareness, I think is a good thing. And the original question is, yeah, absolutely. I think there is a market for good advice at board level that always comes back to value as well. So it's not just spending a huge amount of money. I think the Amazon examples before of the pennies of compute power that you can actually get now on demand it's what makes it so compelling once you get over the hurdle of, is my data secure? And so that's what I start to see. It's like the power of the cloud is very impressive. And we're starting to use it. We're doing, say, chatbots and artificial intelligence, and you're just making calls off to the rooms in the cloud computing, and what you get back is phenomenal. And it's just, so we have a team of software developers, and what they're able to produce is really impressive, whereas previously I would have had to recruit a data scientist. But now I'm just using that knowledge and packaging it up in an application.
Could we just have a, sorry to put you on the spot, ladies and gentlemen, but could we just have a quick show of hands, please, of all the different organisations represented in the room today? Who has a CIO or CTO sitting on your boards? Okay. So there's an opportunity. We can help you with that. So please contact us after this event, and we'll hook up with some of the experts, and we'll talk about some ideas we've got in that space. Okay, Matt, Guernsey observations.
In many ways, similar to some of the stuff that Gary's just described. Perhaps to answer that previous question, a lot of it was, or perhaps the slowness to adopt modern technologies, is probably down to fear or lack of information, scared of losing control. If I can touch my kit, I feel safe scenario that the Amazon guys described. But again, it is changing. As much as I hate to admit it, I think Guernsey, in terms of its adoption of these types of technologies, has been and continues to be behind Jersey, probably anywhere between 3 to 5 years is my kind of gut feeling as to where it is. And there's various reasons for that. But I guess almost to answer the bigger question, or the elephant in the room, with a view to what this means for working and people's jobs and what that looks like in the future, is with the onset of more adoption of cloud computing, but also automation, artificial intelligence, all these other things that are coming, there is that natural fear that surely that's just going to put everyone out of a job. And I think we heard this morning more generally, well, actually that's not going to happen. It just changes the shape. You know, people are still doing the same work. They're just doing it perhaps differently, or in a different place, or perhaps a different set of skills. And one thing that sort of Justin picked up on is that actually you need that awareness of what it means at all levels. I don't think that overnight we can just grow a bunch of people who are building the cloud services that we know exist. You know, that is technical. That needs long, a great deal of education. But what the tools, the great toolkits that we've heard about, and the stuff we see in cloud computing, what that enables, and that's what's really interesting for Guernsey as a jurisdiction. It enables anyone to be an innovator, anyone with an idea or a problem to solve. They now have all this stuff that was previously sort of unavailable or too expensive to access. Anyone can come to that and say, you know what, I'm going to turn it, I'm going to try it and see. And provided, and it's a piece that I'm writing for the press at the moment, provided perhaps, in the way the States adopts it, everyone is okay with failing. That's the biggest sort of barrier to this, is a fear of failure. Provided people get on top of what it means to just give it a go and risk getting it wrong, then actually the benefit of some of these technologies far outweighs a lot of the risks that have been talked about.
So it sounds, to some extent, we've got a bit of a cultural shift to prepare for and engage with, to carry those organisations with us on this journey of technological change, inevitable technological change. So Paul, from a public sector point of view in Guernsey, how do you, what are your observations in terms of how technology can make your life easier?
Well, I suppose I took over a world, and I don't believe, I can't say I'm a person that comes from the world of technology, I'm not, but I understand the advancements of technology and what it can do for us. And what I observed coming into the organisation, that in terms of the evolution of technology, use of IT, etc., really clunky, disparate, disconnected, very much grew up by demand of kit and stuff. Really quite an unattractive mess. So one thing that we knew, and I knew that actually working with my team, that many of the guys and girls around the team were in a similar position, and what we needed was that technology support to aid us with our thinking. We have grown very much in our sort of research and diagnostic of that over the last 2 years, because what we've actually done is mapped out what the entirety of that looks like. Where we've been convinced is, actually, I think it goes back to you, we cannot provide all the solutions of that, and we need help in doing so. So whilst we might have an increase of people with competence in our team, we're actually on the eve of going out and announcing a significant strategic technology partner for the entirety of the public sector for Guernsey. People that have done this stuff elsewhere, that understand if we want to revolutionise how we approach our health systems, our education systems. And by the way, we're already doing stuff in the digital zone, for example, in education with Google Digital. We're not standing still, but there's a whole lot more that we need to concentrate on. So in the next few weeks, you'll all become aware that we'll make an announcement of a preferred partner to go into that strategic partnership with. Because we need that if we're going to be competitive. And I don't, as a jurisdiction, and that includes creating a cloud-based solution for this island, because I think actually data and information is exceptionally important to this island. And it's important not being part of the UK and not part of the EU, that also that information and data is in many respects kept within the jurisdiction for good reasons. Particularly for some of our core industries. So, yeah, for me, it's really having the right people around you to do that, and there's an acknowledgement that you can't just use existing skills. You need to actually invest.
Absolutely. We're really happy to share some of our skills MOT frameworks that we're developing in any way that might help public, private or third sector organisations. So just let me know if you're interested in having those. So Jen, I'm going to come to you now, and then I'll hop over to Ed if that's all right. So we invited Jen to come along because Jen has developed this fantastic app which I'm sure she'll tell you all about if you have a chat to her after this session. But as a mum of William, who's in the audience, I was particularly keen on making sure that children, every child, and in particular my child, but every child on this island has an opportunity to start life with the very best opportunity and the right skills, so when they transition into the world of work, into the world of school, and then ultimately the world of work, they're well prepared for that. So Jen, why don't you tell us a bit about what you're doing and how that might slot into some of the other conversations that we're having on this panel?
Yeah, I really think that the most important point has already surfaced, which is this the point about the attitude that's required to deal with change. So we talk about being able to cope with being ready to fail forward or being ready to try things out, to innovate, to give it a go. We've talked about how a lot of these technologies are now in our hands, but it's still not creating the change because you also need people who have the confidence, the creativity, and the resilience to have a go. And those sorts of skills actually the foundations for those type of skills are set long before you get to learning, deciding to sign up to a new e-learning platform to build your skills in social media or cloud-based computing or whatever it is. That's the first step. And that kind of internal determination, drive, resilience, all of that stuff is already pretty well in place by the time kids even step foot into school. It's extraordinary what we now know from neuroscience and development psychology that by age 5, about 85% of our brains are already developed. And we know that when children arrive at school, there are already big gaps in their development based on the different type of early experiences they've had, the quality of their home learning environment, the amount of interaction and stimulus that they've had with peers and adults. these things really, really shape core foundational areas that go on to predict our outcomes right through school and even into adulthood. So what I'm talking about, I've mentioned social and emotional capacities like resilience, determination, being able to focus our attention in a world where there's more and more stuff coming in to distract us, but also our language, our vocabulary, our ability to communicate well with others, and then of course your kind of physical motor skills development and all the rest of it. We know at age 5 through longitudinal studies we can predict with a really quite upsetting level of accuracy things like future educational outcomes, even future earnings. And a lot of that has to do with attitude and determination and these sorts of factors. It was really becoming more aware of that evidence. And I started my career as a policymaker working in social mobility and understanding how important the early years are as a site for development is what took me, ironically, into the world of technology as a place to solve the problem. I didn't think the world of policy was going to sort of solve this issue on its own. And I ended up looking towards design and innovation to come up with an app that would help parents create a more stimulating home learning environment for their kids. So for me, you can never really start too early. And you know, there's also a fantastic evidence base around what we know we can get a really fantastic return from intervening early. Some great research from a guy called Professor James Heckman, who's based at the University of Chicago. He's won the Nobel Prize in economics. He actually created an economic model to prove the benefits of investing in children's early years. And he found, and I hope this will go down well with the Guernsey audience, a 13.7% return year on year if you invest in an early education program for a disadvantaged child in the first 5 years of their life. And that's actually better than a kind of average tracker fund in the stock market. So I think, you know, when we're thinking about where do we want to invest, both as governments, but also as investors, perhaps, who are socially minded, who are interested in both the financial return and a social return, you can't do much better than investing in the early years. Political short-termism often means that governments don't invest as much as they should and as they want to in the beginning, but people who have patient capital, people who are willing and are high-minded and far-minded enough to think towards the next generation, I think it's a really excellent area to invest your time and your money and your resources and your energy. Certainly what I've decided to do with my time.
Brilliant, thanks Jen. And just for clarity for the audience, from a Bright Futures point of view, what we're interested in is supporting people from cradle to grave. We cover every demographic cohort, and we recognise that when school leavers leave the education system and enter the world of work, as I mentioned this morning, that gap is growing, that level of disappointment from both parties is growing. So we're quite interested in what Jen's doing and piloting her initiative in Guernsey, and we should have the results of that around June time, hopefully. In the view to sort of rolling out island-wide, because we think that if we can start to instill some of those disciplines very early on in life, by the time people do leave school and they enter the world of work, that will go some way to close that gap, because they'll have the 4 Cs already embedded in their DNA, and they'll have that ability to bridge that gap themselves, or to figure out how they can bridge that gap, which is perhaps one of the many missing links in our perhaps antiquated education system in the Western world that we're suffering with today. Ed, what do you see in this space in terms of the biggest challenges or barriers to people adopting cloud technology when the vision of what it can do is so compelling?
Well, I've been at AWS 6 years, and which is kind of like dog years, because we were only founded in AWS as part of Amazon, only came into being in 2006. So I've kind of seen the needle move, and our customers are moving through the spectrum. But what I would say is that there is always a reason for a government body or an education, a school, college, university, not to do something. Customers will always find a reason not to do something, and that's fine, and we're very respectful of the fact that, you know, not everyone can move as fast as we can. But, you know, my job is to speak to prospective customers who are kind of thinking, well, we think the cloud could do something for us, but we're not quite sure how to do it. My job is to help them with two things. It's to build confidence and competence. So we give them the confidence that this technology can help them, and we give them the competence, the skills to be able to implement it in a way which is realistic for their business. We have a whole team of professional services people who have a very rigorous cloud adoption framework methodology we use for customers who are looking at big transformation projects, and that's heavily used, particularly in some of the big government departments, central government departments in the UK and other territories now. But actually, you know, for people who just want to get started in a small way, you know, someone once said that innovation and failure are inseparable twins, aren't they? If you're just doing things and not failing, then actually you're just doing things. You're not really experimenting. So we think if you want to experiment and you're prepared to fail, then fail quickly and use cost-effective technology which will enable you to do that. And gradually, despite the inertia that we sometimes feel from customers, you know, we're prepared to be patient with them. If a customer's not ready to move just yet, or they want to continue doing things how they have been doing them, that's fine, but there will come a point when they'll come back to us, and we see this repeatedly. Every week customers are coming back to us who perhaps weren't ready to do this, and they're saying, okay, we think we're ready to start small, can you help us get started? And that's a big part of what we do. And once we set the rabbit in motion, then they create their own speed and their own momentum. And once people are on that road, then they can move very, very quickly. And I'll take an example from the education sector. So many of you will know UCAS. They control the admissions to all undergraduate places in the UK higher education market. UCAS had tried really hard using traditional IT, on-prem IT, for many years. But of course, the thing with UCAS is, for most days of the year, their systems are quite, you know, they're not under a really heavy load. But on A-level results day, the third Thursday in August, you know, levels peak to maybe 1,500 times what they normally are. And UCAS, like any organization would, found it a real challenge to build for that peak. And, you know, you can build for the peak, of course, but it then means for all the rest of the year, when the demand's down here somewhere, you have all that wasted investment in the technology that you probably don't need most of the year. And I think they're a really good example of an organization that was innovative. They saw the potential of cloud. They had all sorts of reasons why not to do it, but they were bold. They did a huge project. They migrated to the AWS cloud in their words, they reckon they did an 18-month project in 6 months in 2013. They moved into the cloud, and suddenly the systems were coping with this peak load without even breaking sweat. And you know, by UCAS's own admission, they were facing challenges which were not just technology challenges, but existential challenges. You know, many institutions were saying, well, actually, we think we're capable of doing our own admissions, so do we even need a monopolistic centralized body in the UK? But UCAS did such a fantastic job, and they had such great leadership, and they overcame that inertia that they'd previously been feeling, that they've completely restored faith in their systems. They've rebuilt the UCAS brand, and they're going through their own much wider transformation now to think how they can contribute not just to the UK undergraduate admission system, but to the wider education ecosystem, because, you know, after all, they have pretty much more data on students past and present, you know, going back 40 years than anyone else. So the message here is we speak to customers every day who have got reasons not to do this, and maybe they're afraid, maybe they've got existing investments to write down, maybe they've got data sovereignty issues or security issues, but if we work with them and we show patience, then they can see the benefits, they see it for themselves, and then once they get going, there's no stopping them.
Brilliant. I think one of the expressions I picked up from an OECD event last year sometime when we were talking about technological advancement, innovation, disruption, was we're not all expected to be absolute experts in the field, but I think the general currency of digital literacy has to increase across every profession, regardless of what you do. And an expression was used, you don't have to run as fast as a horse, but you need to know how to ride it. So if the opportunity presents itself, you can grab that with two hands and you can run with it. And I'm guessing it feels a bit like we need to sort of demystify it a bit. We need to have some of that thought leadership entering boardrooms and having it sort of perhaps as a standing boardroom agenda, which is something that we're passionate about from a generalist human capital point of view. But I absolutely see the digital skill gap in the islands as being something that's quite significant and therefore presents perhaps quite a risk to our perhaps growth prospects. Any other observations you'd like to sort of throw in the ring?
I think I'm not massively worried about skills gap in terms of I haven't got quite enough SQL developers, because we're quite conscious that we're subscale in terms of we live on a small island, so I've got increasing confidence in, especially listening to you, that if we can cover off the early bit, Jen, I've got increasing confidence in the curriculum in the school here. It's what we do before and after. Certainly with my GTA hat on, when we're looking at specifically running techie courses, whether it's in SQL or Microsoft's MCSE type stuff, some of the challenges that we face there is that there's just not enough people wanting to do it, and there's not quite enough demand. So if we, Matt and I will talk about this and spoken about it with some of the other IT companies, we probably only have one person requiring one specific course every couple of years. So it's how we burst into that, and that I think will be using cloud services on demand. We've all got a smartphone, so we can all do these sorts of things without having to attend an institution. And we've got to take a bit of responsibility as well, and personally look at some of the online providers for those bits of education. And then it's up to us with Bright Futures to pick up the rest, right? Fill in the gaps, I suppose.
I think it's a really good point you make, Justin, that, and I think somebody else, Carly, I think it was you actually, posed, maybe it wasn't, somebody from the audience asked the question, whose responsibility is it? Is it my employer's responsibility? Should they be paying for me to upskill and give me the time out of the office? Is it the government's responsibility? Should they be supporting this? Is it organisations like Bright Futures' responsibility to be taking ownership of challenges like this? Or is it my personal responsibility? And I think the answer is it's probably a combination of all of that. I think from my perspective, you know, Guernsey is a unique island, and whilst we have a small population, the public sector here has a mighty challenge in its hand in terms of delivering services across a multitude of different departments in a high quality and efficient and effective way. But I think as time passes and different opportunities present themselves, it will be the private sector and increasingly the third sector that are required to step up and take some of that responsibility from them. And quite rightly so. And I think on that note, I think it's important that we help people to understand that we didn't feel the pain of the global financial crisis here in 2008 like many did. Some of the organisations contracted, and we saw, for example, training budgets shrink, marketing budgets shrink, but not on a scale that we saw in other jurisdictions or indeed in the UK. And I think because of that, we're perhaps not quite as well prepared as we perhaps need to be or could or should be for some of the anticipated challenges on the horizon economically and socially right now. You know, I think, Paul, you mentioned, or Gavin mentioned this morning, that the demographic of the workforce of the public sector in itself is a massive, massive challenge. And that is reflected in other lines of work in the private sector and indeed in the third sector. And that's going to present an interesting challenge to this island, because on the one hand, we should be celebrating longevity and upskilling that population who are going to live for decades longer than they perhaps anticipated when they first started out in life and started to think about pensions provision and how am I going to pay for my life and what does my retirement look like, to, oh crikey, this is looking a bit different because I'm going to be living longer because of the advancements in technology and medicine, etc. And that's all going to have an implication on what we're doing. So I think we have got some interesting opportunities to help fill some of these gaps. But I think it does require a bit of personal responsibility as well as corporate responsibility as well as government responsibility. It has to be a triangulated effort. And in a small jurisdiction like this, there's absolutely no reason why we can't achieve that.
I'll add to that actually, from the perspective of someone who runs a small technical focused business. And when I arrived in Guernsey 10, 12 years ago with a PhD in a technical discipline, but zero business relevant experience or skills, I was really lucky that the first job I landed, they knew what they were doing and they provided me with the mentorship that kind of showed me how to apply what I knew into the real world. And so on the day that the Guernsey College had just announced that they're expanding the apprenticeship scheme to include these new areas like retail and care and whatever it was, I think that's definitely something that the state should be conscious of, that I really want to pay forward that great start in Guernsey that I got in terms of the mentorship, but when I'm running a small business, it's really difficult for me. So there's kind of a conscious effort there amongst everyone, which is the individual who either is leaving school and wants to learn this stuff, or they're moving from somewhere else and they want to, cross over into the technical industry. There's an onus on me, because if I invest in these people through time rather than perhaps financial, then hopefully I get the benefit, the wider community get the benefit. But if the states can recognise that as well and enable me to do that, then that's that kind of holistic view where everyone hopefully benefits.
Yeah, I would add to that as well, because I was thinking about, again, the role of aspiration and having people to look up to if you're a young person, or even if you're mid in your career and you're thinking of moving, you still need examples of people to inspire you and to follow on. And I often think of that particularly in relation to women and girls who are less well represented in STEM and technology, but have loads to offer, and especially, we're all interested in that, but especially in a small population, you want to think, well, how do we get the most out of everyone in our community? And I think one of the really crucial elements to that is this idea of mentorship and building aspiration through showing and giving a platform to entrepreneurs or people who are doing interesting work that other people can look up to. And I've mentioned to Peasy, a group that I work with that I'm on the advisory board of, called Founders for Schools, which is a great scheme that gets entrepreneurs and founders into schools to speak to young people. And I love those sorts of ideas that are just based on getting people together and animating people's ideas and inspiring them to think differently and say, oh, it could happen because they've done it. It's just so much easier to imagine if you've got an example of someone doing it that you can look at and speak to. And I think for women and girls, that can be particularly powerful.
Actually, I've got a blatant plug here. We've got a Women in Tech STEM bursary that's still live at the moment. I think we've had 6 applicants, which I'm really chuffed about so far, but there's plenty of space for more, so please shout that from the rooftops. We're getting a bit of stick for female-only bursary, but it's well worth it to redress that.
Hey,
Thanks.
I'm going to do the same. I'm trying to hire a product designer right now. I would love it if it was a woman or minority. It's over in London, but if anyone knows folks in London, particularly women, do let me know.
So one of the ways I like to conclude a meeting, Gary will be sort of very familiar with this, is so what now what? It's okay. We've talked about change. We've talked about how cloud can present huge opportunities, not without its challenges, and it's overcoming the fear and the cultural shift that we need to go through. Perhaps an upskilling or re-education, or reskilling of a whole host of people in employment and out of employment today to help us on that journey. But so what now what? And I think what my call of action to you would be, please go away, think about how we can help you in your own organisations to start to think about how you're going to bridge that gap on a personal level, on a departmental level, on an organisational level. And where are you getting that thought leadership from? And how can we help you add that as a standing boardroom agenda at a time where, I get it, you know, you're keeping the shareholders happy, you're keeping the regulator happy, you're keeping your other stakeholders happy. It's tough out there. You're fighting for new business. I get all of that. So let us share some of that burden with you and work with some of our experts who are here today to make some real changes happen. So round of applause to my panel, please. Thanks very much indeed, guys.
Thank you.